Get up and get out. Get out. Get out.
I have a question for you.
Say Christ is Lord. Say Christ is Lord. Say it. You say Christ is Lord. Get out. Get out. Christ is Lord.
Joining me today, guys, this is a special episode of Offensively Accurate, and I'm your host, Atlas Thugged, aka White Boy Deep Voice, aka another racially ambiguous Goiper, and I am proud to be joining with me is Taylor Young from Antelope Hill Publishing, and they were gracious enough to gift me multiple books, and all of them are great. The first of which we will be exploring is going to be The Sword of Christ from and by Giles Corey. This was originally banned off of Amazon in 2020, which I do believe it's come back around 2024. I could be wrong about that. But we're going to explore a lot of the robust and comprehensive nature of what is inside of this book. And specifically inside of this book is essentially a comprehensive guide for Christians understanding today, not only just the heresies of Zionism, but also understanding how we got here, all of the cruelty that's kind of hidden and obfuscated in and from the Middle East, and everything else that kind of revolves around that in terms of Christian racialism, and it's rather robust. So with that out of the way, joining me is Taylor Young. Who are you, sir, and what do you do?
Hello. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me on. I am Taylor Young. I am Antelope Hill's marketing and outreach director. So I do this, among many other things. I basically help promote our books online, on social media, on podcasts, on different stuff. I help our authors get interviews and reviews and so on. So I'm happy to be on here talking with you.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate that very much. And the book itself was amazing. I actually had gotten a bit of flack from a couple of my guys in the community because I was sending in a couple of snippets. I was taking photos of what I had highlighted. And one of my top guys, he sends a message. He was like, "You never get this hype with any of the stuff that I send you." And it made me feel bad, but I was like, listen, like this book is really, really good. And I guess really, I think to go ahead and start with, one of the first things I think I want to get to is the idea of we really don't know who the author is.
I mean, I know, but I can't tell you, unfortunately.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, he's obviously goes by a pen name, Giles Corey, and we've asked him. He has no interest in doing any public appearances. He's never done interviews, so I don't think that that's going to change. Unfortunately, you kind of have to take it for what it is. But yeah, to go back to just clarify something you said earlier, the book was banned on Amazon. I think that's part of the reason why he ended up submitting it to us. And as soon as we read it, we started our review process. I think we realized pretty quickly that this is something that's definitely the kind of thing that we want to be publishing. So we were able to put it back into print form. I think it is on Amazon again. Some of our books can be found on Amazon. So the reason it's back on there now is because we republished it. So it's our edition. Some of our books get banned. Some of them are still up there. We've had a lot of issues with Amazon. So, if it disappears at some point, I wouldn't be too surprised. But that's a little bit of the history behind it.
It's interesting. Is that kind of like a bit of the strategy there with Antelope Hill, is kind of looking for books that were banned that would fall kind of like in your sphere?
Well, not necessarily books that were banned. I mean, if they're good and they were banned, then we definitely want to help bring them back. But yeah, books that are out of print, we have a policy of not trying to compete with other publishers that are doing similar things. So like, we're not gonna publish some books that people sometimes will or frequently ask us about. Like, for example, we're not going to publish Mein Kampf, that's already published by Clemens and Blair. We're not going to publish Codriano. I don't remember who has his book, but I'm pretty sure you can get it in other places already. So yeah, a big part of our business model is looking for stuff that is out of print or unavailable in English, or just otherwise not currently available.
Interesting. And I think there's a couple other up and coming publishers, but we'll keep them out because we're not going to be competitive here. And all the links for your guys' information will be in the description below for anybody who wants to check out the Substack, follow you guys on X, and as well as just visit your website and get themselves some books. So anybody interested after this conversation, definitely go there and check them out. I guess I wanted to go back to on the being anonymous. I understand that and I get that. And this seems to be a problem that's plaguing the Christian dissident sphere in general. And I know there's been some back and forth about it. I know some people kind of come out with these opinions where they feel like it's going to have to go at some point. People need to put skin in the game. But at the same time, you see those who have had their lives destroyed by being doxxed and threatened and otherwise being pushed out of their professional lives. I guess I'm kind of curious, where do you stand, and where do you think this book kind of stands on the issue of like remaining anonymous while also trying to pursue the recapturing of Christianity in the West?
I don't know if the book really addresses it. I think that where I stand is that anonymity is absolutely and should be a right. I think I would tend to find it suspicious, or at least unhelpful if people are pushing against it too hard, just because it is still like one of the number one strategies that you can use to actually be able to speak freely. And in many cases, to tell the truth, you need to speak freely. So I'm definitely for maintaining anonymity as an option. I think that if people choose to go without that, they absolutely deserve additional praise and support for that reason. I think that it very much depends, to have like your job be fired from your job, or just like your job be discovered. Like, these things have disparate impacts for different people. Some people are just much more able to weather any kind of storm that might come their way from speaking their mind. Other people are not, and I don't think that it's really fair to judge that.
No, I get that. Seems to be like there is a split down the line of people who are employed versus people who kind of employ themselves. The ones who employ themselves, it seems to be like the number one thing they'll go and target is your place of employment. A lot of people's lives aren't structured in a way where they could lose the access to, a white collar job like that and immediately, reconstitute their lives or restore what may be lost in terms of mortgages and such. We know how the economy is as well too. And these are some of the easy tactics they use. And I personally have gone back and forth on it. I completely agree with you in terms of it being a right and it needs to be upheld. I guess the only direction I foresee it is the closer we get to reaching an end goal, I feel like is where the animosity will probably begin to be pulled back, but that'll almost just be naturally. The closer you get to your side winning, the more socially it won't be seen as reprehensible or be attacked as much, I guess I would say.
Right, for sure. I think that it's also relevant that people have different judgments on how close we are to that. And I think sometimes people who think, we're almost there, they tend to be a little harsher on anonymity. And I think that's, there's disagreement there. I would somewhat disagree. I think that we have a long way to go. And for the foreseeable future, anonymity is going to continue to be valuable.
Yes, no, definitely. I agree. I am someone I personally am a bit of an accelerationist, which I know there's a split even on that between incrementalism, accelerationist, and revolutionaries. But I would agree with that. I think we are well outside of a decade at the minimum of foreseeing anything. I think that would be like the next level substantiation of seeing a win or a consequential positive in that direction. The next I guess I would want to move on to is right off the rip. And I love the way that Corey writes. Giles Corey, and you can just tell. I think some people might have said that maybe it was multiple authors, but after reading through, it's like it's very consistent tonation and word usage. So to me, it feels like it's got to be the only one guy. And you said
Have
it is the
people
one
said
guy.
that?
Yeah,
Are there like theories floating out there about this book? That's that's kind
yeah,
of funny to me, actually. I didn't know that.
yeah. Because I had asked around to a couple of individuals who I thought might be familiar with it, and one of them said, I think there might be multiple people who wrote that one. Um, but after reading through it, I'm like, there's no way. It's very obvious, at least to me, how the tonation's very consistent through it. But right off the rip, Corey goes directly at the NIV translation. And this is also a topic of discussion. And of one, I will only explore the element here, which is that the NIV is essentially owned by Rupert Murdoch. And there's a long list, right, being a subsidiary of also, I'm forgetting the other company. It's like HarperCollins is the other big publisher here, umbrella company. And it turns out owned by News Corp, which is also the same company that owns Fox News. And this seemingly is a very consistent problem through categorically almost everything, which is an institution is owned by a philo-Semite. And I'd posed to you earlier in the outline, if there's any other translations like this, but it feels pretty obvious when you read the NIV and you read the way they change a lot of the gendered language that there was clearly an attempt to subvert something. So I'm kind of curious with that, how do you feel about the translations? Do you have a preferred translation? And do you think there should be one that stands above the rest?
Yeah, I wouldn't feel really confident enough to put one above the others. I personally, uh, I use the ESV. I like that one. I've heard that there's some issues with it. I don't really know. I've heard like some people prefer the KJV, some people prefer, I forget what other one that I've heard, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think that you kind of have to be open to the reality that anything mainstream, anything that's integrated into the current economy is probably has Jewish hands on it at some point.
Right.
And that may have some negative consequences for what ends up being the final product. I don't really have the information to speak about it more than that, but that's kind of I think just a reality that we have to deal with.
No, definitely. And it seems more and more you can find somebody, and you're seeing more and more content creators, younger even by the day too, who come up with, do you know who owns Toys R Us? Do you know who owns? It's just like down the line, and it's funny seeing more and more of the mass noticing, if you will. And moving on though, getting back into more specifics of the book, the thing that stuck out to me a lot actually was Giles' 2024 preface. And I think the reason why it stuck out to me a lot was because obviously it was banned in 2020 and it was published, I would imagine he had written it before 2020. So it's pre a lot of the recent developments last 5 years that we have gone through. When it was republished, I imagine by you guys, he had came back with the forward by Kevin MacDonald and the 2024 preface. And in there, I found a lot of very intriguing things. And it almost seemed a lot harsher than where he was at in 2020, which I think shows you and reflects a bit of how quickly things can degenerate. And the one quote that kind of really caught me off guard, and we're going to just get right into a bit of the more spicy stuff, was, quote, I have far more faith in African Christianity at this point than I do in the Western churches, end quote. And that was said in a very specific context. And it was amidst him lightening his critiques on the African church, because in just the last 5 years, he had seen that there was somehow they were the most intolerant towards sodomy. And it was in that he was saying, well, at least I will give them their flowers on this element. And so it just got me thinking, what is it specifically that makes sodomy so widely and openly accepted in like the white communities versus the African church communities?
Yeah, it's a good question. And just to go back for 1 second, so the edition that you have of the book is the third edition. So the first one is the one that he published himself. The second one is what we originally published, and then he came to us, I think a couple year or two later with the updated one with the new preface, and so that makes it the third edition.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, what is it that makes this kind of a more evident or a more widely present problem for white Christians, I think was your question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that really everything goes back to it's been a long process, obviously, to get to this point, the subversion of Christianity. And really, the subversion of Christianity in the West is just the subversion of Western civilization. I think Corey makes that point later in the book as well, that in fact the church was one of the last institutions to fall to liberalism. But it has fallen to liberalism, and so the issues with Christianity are really the issues with liberalism. And liberalism really had its final victory in 1945, or at least that's the way I see it, where it defeated its primary competitors, and then through the Cold War, it triumphed over its final competitor, which was there's a lot of complexities to that. Obviously, communism isn't good in and of itself, even if the kind of relationship between the Soviet Union and its peoples became a little complicated down the line. Yeah, so I mean, the way I think about it, the way I've thought about it for a long time, and I think kind of like once you see this, you can't really unsee it, is that most people, they think that liberalism is Christianity. And so they've replaced the sins and the, what makes you good and what makes you bad, that you should get from Christianity, they've replaced that with liberalism. So, you know, the relevant sin here from Christianity, from the Bible, from God's word, is sodomy. That's, God said, don't do this. This is evil. But when Christians approach it today, it's almost as if like that isn't the relevant sin. The relevant sin is, intolerance of sodomy, or like intolerance of people's choices. And that's really what they get more upset about, which doesn't make any sense. And I think that's, to me at least, that was one of the ways in which I kind of began to question my own liberal priors, by just thinking about how, well, obviously, like, how does it make any sense for me as a Christian to value this almost like kind of intermediate step between what above what God's word actually says? Like, God says this is bad, don't do this. This is good, you should do this. That should be how we seek to orient our lives, both individually and collectively. But whenever you get to that collective step, then liberalism kind of steps in, and so that shows you that that's the real sovereign.
Which is great that you make the point about the liberalism, because it seems that it was a very specific kind of liberalism, and the kind that is, as I'm kind of described before, one that took rugged individualism to a step that didn't just have a relationship with collectivism, but made collectivism its enemy. And that's kind of where a lot of these elements, you almost have a majority of social institutions, specifically for whites as well. You see it less so with the other groups, but very specific institutions basically guiding you from the beginning steps of education to keep you from involving yourself with the collective. Like consistent reminders that you are an individual. Now, it's good in the sense of remembering that you are an individual with individual choices. You yourself are individually accountable. But it goes so far to say that the collective is bad inherently. And I think part of that is also marred in with the kind of, the anti-red, anti-communist kind of just general political, output that you were getting from the majority of our politicos through that period. And so I'm kind of curious, like, how do we overcome that? How do you overcome the collective argument when I feel like the lowest hanging fruit, someone in the a typical MAGA circle will throw back at you, which is, well, you just want race communism. What's kind of the response to something like that?
Well, I think there's probably multiple ways you could approach it. For one, it's actually just not possible to live out individual convictions like on their own. That's actually just a meaningless concept. Say you oppose homosexuality, you oppose homosexual marriage. If this is something you are required or feel required to maintain as like a purely individual opinion, then eventually you're just going to like stop manifesting it in any way at all, because like if you manifest it to other people, then it becomes a collective issue. If you want it to be reflected in government, that becomes a collective issue. If you want, it to be reflected in society, if you're concerned with homosexuals having access to your children, if you're concerned with what your children are taught in school, even if you don't want to send them to school, there's just this perpetual running away from the, like you said, this kind of boogeyman of collectivism, in particularly on the kind of mainstream libertarian tinted conservative right. And really it's just a running away from reality. It's not even really I don't think it should even be seen as like a ideological position so much, because the ideology, to the extent there is one there, is libertarianism, and you can kind of debate libertarianism, you can deconstruct it, but really I think in a lot of ways it is just kind of like an emotional response. It's a fear of conflict, it's a fear of confrontation, it's a just abandonment of responsibility to your society, to your own children. To live is to exist in a collective context. And I don't think that even just setting individualism and collectivism at odds with each other, that in itself is already kind of like the conservative brained way of seeing this. Life is about more important things. Life is about what principles you actually believe, where they come from, and whatever you believe is what you're going to end up wanting to see reflected and necessarily to some extent imposed on others. So if all you want to impose on others is just leave me alone, libertarianism, then that is, those are your actual principles. That is the sum total of what you really believe.
Well, such as the death of the West. I mean, if you were asking me, if you were to look at the much like the Israeli occupation, the Zionist occupation of our government and nation was two-pronged, both a top and a lower end. I also see the same thing on the low end of what, the actions of men like in my father's generation did, which was exactly what you just described. It was this sense of, well, as long as they leave me alone and don't come into my yard, who cares? Just leave me out of it. But this escapism categorically across the board has generated the society that we live in now, which was, if none of our guys are going to run for positions of power, none of our guys are going to be near the levers of power or influential or vying for positions on school boards as a judge, etc., well, then you will be ruled by the people who were left, which were the people that hate you. And so this is kind of where we are. And so I'm actually radically against any more escapism. I do understand elements in certain contexts, with church hopping and stuff. I think there are certain times where you have to kind of call it quits, maybe go find a different, branch to go to, maybe on the individual level. But I guess that to me is one of the biggest things I've always pushed back against. And it is in that sense of what you had said, which was there's somehow this fear of responsibility. And I would go so far as to say, inside of that fear, inside of collectivism, to me, there feels like there's a fear of hierarchy. And normally understanding the way that men behave and interact, this wouldn't make any sense, because as it's typically told, men operate better under hierarchy. But when you see the way that a lot of the kind of infighting occurs in the dissident right, it does kind of give this feeling as if everyone's trying to vie to be the number one top guy, and this kind of kingmaker infighting. And so I'm kind of curious, in terms of that hierarchy, do you think there may be an element that we have become maybe a bit too liberal brained in living in this liberal society, that there will be an element of difficulty into getting men to accept hierarchy or being in a position that's lower than what they would expect they are worthy of?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think that it's probably more complicated than that, depending on what the specific context is. But yeah, for sure. I mean, that is something that you see a lot of, and that is kind of like an unhelpful version of individualism that has plagued, and every aspect of the right as broadly as you can possibly define it. There's been this tendency to split off, to make differences of opinion or personality into reasons to fight each other instead of fight the actual enemy. So, but I don't know. I personally think that at the core of a lot of that is also ultimately a kind of fear or desire to avoid confrontation, because if you can make the confrontation about like this person to your right or to your left instead of the actual enemy, then that saves you from having to fight the actual enemy. So I think that a
Yeah.
lot of people are willing to just come up with literally any reason to not fight the actual battle.
Which is unfortunate because I think that across the board you can see, this abdication of responsibility and duty. I mean, I think for most men you can just see it; they physically wear it. To me, I'm a kind of a personal health, nut. Came from as a personal trainer, and I love the quote where how shameful would it be for a man to go and not see what they could do, with their body, and I think you see that, and I think just in the TPUSA halftime show, which was, in my opinion, I didn't enjoy it. But one of the lyrics that's been getting heavily shared around was on the same vein of what we're talking about. I just want to drink my beer and drive my truck, and it's like we're in a civilizational war. It's like how is this your mindset, right? You just want to like go and be left alone. To me, I don't understand that, but I guess at the same time, it probably does come from what you're saying, this fear of confrontation, this fear of actually getting involved and having to pick a side. But at the same time, I think that's good. I think for too many times I get in conversations with individuals, whether it be about Christianity at large or maybe just something other that's in the political sphere that's, spicy or hot. And it's almost as if they've never thought about the subject before. And so when you're posing a question, they're like, well, I've never thought about this. It's like, how? This is a top element issue in the nation that's been discussed for the last 3.5 years. How have you gone out of your way to avoid encountering this, or even at least engaging with it, so you would know in the back of your head, this is how I feel about, object X. And that to me is just wild, because we're not even getting a full-fledged conflict in the civilizational war. It's really between people who are paying attention, while all the people who aren't paying attention kind of are bystanders. They're like NPCs. They're kind of, the normies. You get these kind of different pejoratives, if you will. And I guess with that, and the sort of the Christ being a little bit of a wake-up call, giving people tools, in your opinion, like, what is this kind of, how do you get someone who's in that sphere, who doesn't want to get involved? What's your first thing that you bring to them that's like, I think this will make them get up off the couch?
Well, I think that you can't make someone into a revolutionary who doesn't want to be one. People have to have a conviction, and you can be a part of helping them discover that conviction, but you can't like force someone into having a conviction. I think that it really has more to do with um, personality and like attachment to fundamental principles than it has even necessarily to do with knowledge or ideology. Someone who is fundamentally offended by injustice or dishonesty is someone who is, a better potential dissident than someone who just has like a kind of surface level conservative ideology of like, I want to shoot my guns and fish my fish and drink my beer
Right.
and so on. And that's kind of where it stops. You can
Right.
present people with information. I think you can help them think differently about current or past events. You can, tell them about things they wouldn't have known before, but the reaction is kind of up to them. They have to feel a responsibility to something that's going to drive them to take action.
Yeah. It's kind of what people are now calling maybe the natural IQ filter, or just the natural filter in general, which is the people who you would want on your side are going to be here already. And the people who you probably don't want to be, joining you side by side in rank is someone who's already on the couch. Just kind of this natural filter that exists with what you said, conviction. Because on elements like this, when you know that the enemy wants to annihilate you and destroy your life and hang you up, essentially crucify you, you don't want to have somebody to the left of you who you might be questioning how loyal will they be if money starts being waved in their face, or something to that effect too. So I completely agree. I only want really to have most convicted people around me. But moving on from there, I guess another element that has been very prominent in this kind of discussion the last couple of years, and was also a little bit mentioned in the preface there too, but it does seem to be that there is maybe perhaps the stronger element of all of this, and I've posed this before too, between, the three questions, right? I guess you could throw in the Christian question as well, but the JQ, the women question, and the race question, or race realism. And to me, I've begun to feel like the women question is actually becoming the most important question. And to me, my basic argument for that would be this. It is the most far-reaching. Women, there are a lot more women in men's lives. Well, this could be maybe need to be statistically looked at. But to me, I feel like it's a lot more hands-on. Men experience a lot more of the fallout of feminism than they do the fallout of the racialized components, that they feel the fallout of just overall Zionist control. Now, again, feminism largely being pushed by Zionists, so it's kind of one and the same. But to me, I do feel like there is this strong element of, we have too many men that are taking their cues from women, or are thus seeking the approval of women, and it's kind of the complete inverse. And the way this was described to me was in a photo. It was great. And so it's in the photo, it's in the garden, and it's when Eve is reaching out to take the apple from the serpent. And it's as the serpent's coming down the tree, she's looking up at the tree as the serpent's coming out with the apple for her. And the man, instead of looking at the serpent or the apple, is looking at her. And it's in this photo that you kind of get the symbology, the visualization that the man is taking the cues from the woman. Like, he was too late. He should have been there to say no. And the guy describes in this little video, he says in the correct order would be that, God is actually out here, talking to Adam. Adam's taking his signals from God, and the wife is taking her signals from the husband. And then in the end, she's stomping on the serpent. And so we kind of have this complete 180 of this natural prioritization. And so I'm kind of curious, where would you kind of rank these issues? And what do you think is the most prominent, important? And furthermore, what would be the best to actually try to tackle first?
Yeah. So in short, I think it's the Jewish question that should take priority, and I guess I would defend that in a couple of ways. First, to kind of deal with the topic of the woman question itself. If you believe in hierarchy and a biblical understanding of not just gender roles, but where they ultimately stem from, which is the order of God's creation, then what can you understand that women are fundamentally followers,
Yeah.
and that's not to like absolve them of their sin. Every woman who's had an abortion, for example, has done something that's just unambiguously evil. And people definitely go too far in like absolving them of responsibility. But at the same time, they're not the driving force behind things. You can, I mean, it's very obvious that their interests as a group are purely degenerative. They are purely just like a force with no will of its own, that the more you set it free, the more you liberate it, the more it's just going to like do increasingly self-destructive things. And so, obviously that's very bad for a civilization, but that's not a sign that like women are the drivers behind the problem. The problem is feminism. The problem is the everything that led to this situation.
Right.
And that's not to like blame. People also go too far with like blaming men for everything. It's like, men have to step up. They have to take leadership. There's no way around that. You can to some extent say that men failing to take leadership is a big part of the problem. You
Yeah.
can't, I think, go so far as to say that that's the whole problem. Uh, but yeah, and I think I can also maybe try to tie this back a little bit to the conversation about liberalism and individualism. I think you've made a little bit of a distinction between like modern individualism and the kind of like rugged individualism that we associate with some of the positive aspects of our identity. And that's something that's noted by Corey in the book. It's something that's noted by Kevin MacDonald in his foreword and his own works, and something in general that's been a long topic of study on the right is, to what extent is individualism something that's a uniquely European trait? And people have different opinions on this. I personally tend to fall on the side of that. I think it, to some extent, is. I think it's possible to overdo the extent to which it is. But I think I would tend to agree with you, which is that, or what I kind of heard in what you were saying is that, like, having this trait of individualism doesn't in and of itself predispose you to like destroying civilization,
Right.
And so, the same thing here, like, in short, I don't think that a civilization kills itself through like self-generated ideology. I think at the basis of everything is group conflict. And I think that is something that's empirically testable. You can study it. You can. Another great resource for this, besides, of course, Kevin MacDonald and his work, Culture of Critique, which we've published, is also Josh Neal, another author that we've published. He's all of his books kind of deal with this. That underlying everything fundamentally is group conflict, and you can trace all of these forces back to the interests of competing groups with each other. So in whose interest is it to introduce feminism and gender wars to an in-group, to white civilization? Well, most fundamentally, it's in the Jewish interest, and this is something that they brag about themselves. The whole history of Jewish involvement in intellectual movements and all kinds of social movements in the West has been to introduce these kind of ideas and to get white people fighting themselves instead of anybody else. So I think that is the root of the poison, and it's not just the root in like a kind of abstract sense. It's like the Jews are bad and they do bad things. It's the root in a very, very traceable sense. Like you can trace how these things have developed. You can just like logically reason out that this is ultimately fundamentally the result of group conflict. So that's essentially the way I see it.
Yeah. No, I like what you said about the about women's nature in general, right? Being this very easily adaptable, kind of flippant, whimsical thing, and they're not the drivers of it. And I agree with that. I think that's actually a great way to actually look at it, as like the feminist element is almost like the foot soldier of enhancing and ensuring these things maintain themselves, which is feminism, Zionist control, men taking their cues from them. And I guess back on the individualism point for a second. Yeah.
Do you mind if I just real quick jump in on that? Because I think it's also relevant to point out that some of the arguments that you sometimes see on the women question specifically are actually just wrong. Like people who go too hard on like it's women and women's voting and women's interests that's like destroying our society. And if you look at the electoral map, for example, in the U.S., if white women voted, you'd still get only Republican presidents. And even kind of like a step beyond that, it's like people sometimes get mad at women for voting for like the wrong party. And it's like, well, who's the right party? If they voted for the right wing parties, they get the same things those right wing parties have done, which is frankly introduce immigration and a whole bunch of other stuff. Like there's no good choices here. And the problem is really the system much more than it is like the people who are abused by the system. Yeah,
no, and like I do agree with that, right? When you look at terms of like the voting pattern, I think it's a moot point because you bring it up, like who they're voting for and what we've gotten from all those votes anyways, even if they voted, quote unquote correctly, it was like what was positively consequential about that? Quite literally nothing. So it's like that almost is kind of not even worth even bringing up. And I do like the point that you bring up the white woman element because he separated it for white. It was, a red map. For men, it was a red map. And it was very specific groups, all of which we already knew it was going to be left wing and monolithic at that. I think it was the female black vote was something like, it was like a 95%, monolith, essentially, all voting for the similar things. And it's kind of wild how easily they've adapted that. But I was going to go back and as you were talking about, who benefits the most from this kind of gender war element. I know we're kind of hanging on the subject a little bit, but I do think it is very important because in the light of all the Epstein dump, we've gotten a lot of very similar themes, which is Jewish supremacy. So I guess in the light of that, what do the Jewish people get out of pushing these things? Like, what is the end goal? If you could expand on that, like, what are they getting out of pushing these things on Gentile populations?
I think the first kind of step is they get, material benefit. They get dominance in society by breaking down the in group. They get self-preservation. They get like a safer situation for themselves. They've always preferred, and everything that has everything Jews have ever been accused of, you can find them saying about themselves somewhere. It's like one of the most anti-Semitic things you could ever do is just like read the foreword or read Haaretz or something and just repeat what they say about themselves.
Right.
But in any case, so yeah, the Jewish interests are first and foremost, they're just very material. They're going to be safer in a multiracial country where they are one minority among other minorities, as opposed to being a identifiable minority in an otherwise like majoritively cohesive state. They benefit from libertarianism because it teaches the native population to not think of itself collectively while the Jews continue to think of themselves collectively. They benefit from breaking down the family. It's all kind of ultimately the same thing. It's their competition for power and resources and safety. And after World War II, but more so actually, I think into the Cold War, when there was somewhat of a anti-Jewish turn in the Soviet bloc, they identified really just authoritarianism itself as a problem among Gentiles, obviously, of course, and so a lot of this stuff that's anti-family comes out of that because and I don't remember off the top of my head their names. I think you can read some of this stuff in articles on UNS and probably other places. But they identified the nuclear family as almost like an inherently fascist institution, as a basis for authoritarianism and therefore as a basis ultimately for, Gentile collective consciousness, and therefore something that was to be destroyed. And so a lot of the anti-family stuff ultimately like comes out of that. It's all related to the same thing. And then I think on a deeper level, you kind of have to ask, well, why though? Because not every group like tries to advance its own interests in these ways specifically. Like even groups that you may not like, like Black people or I don't know, like Lebanese or anyone else, or Chinese, like they don't, even where they're present in other countries, they don't immediately just like start focusing on producing pornography and, developing all kinds of socially destructive ideas. And so I think that at that point, you're getting to something that's more unique about the Jewish people themselves. And there's different ways of understanding that. I think if you're a Christian, it's at least a significant part of understanding that is their rejection of Christ and how that fundamentally defines the Jewish identity and therefore them as a people. There really is, there does seem to be just something spiritually distinct about these people that leads them to have interests that are, like St. Paul said in Thessalonians, they oppose all of humanity, they oppose all mankind. And there's a great, I think I don't remember what part of the book this is in. It might be in MacDonald's foreword, where he quotes a British historian who is kind of looking at the just like the history of the Jews in the ancient world. And he literally comes to the same conclusion that you can find in Paul's writing in Thessalonians, that it really just it's hard to get away from this observation that these people seem to have a unique hatred for all of mankind. And so I think ultimately there is, at the very least, even if you don't want to go with the Christian theological understanding, which I think both of us do, but even if you don't want to go with that, there is something that's obviously fundamentally different about this specific group in comparison with all other groups.
Yeah, I think if you were to go, well, I guess you would have to tie in the Christian theological view as well. But the other thing, I think the big other element is just being stateless, being a nomadic people, is the diaspora. There's these kind of elements that also makes them, I think, radically different, just having groups across the world, but also globally holding, very, very monolithic kind of views on things. However, not all of them are monolithic. The points that you had made, however, about being contrary to all men was actually brought up by someone we'll talk to about here in a little bit, Krie Baller, who is now making headlines and headways left and right after the Religious Liberty Commission, and which we'll talk about here in a second. But before we get away from a bit of what was addressed in the 24 preface, it'll be the last thing really here, because Giles spends a lot of time on it, is the just brutality and grotesque nature of what is occurring in Gaza, in the, you know, the 2 million people, and I believe the figures is anywhere from 70,000 to 200,000 women and children have died, I believe, just in the last 2 years alone. And not only just that, you look at like the numbers of journalists who have been killed. You know, it's rapidly outpacing things like World War II. And I know you said you had a good bit of school of knowledge on this. And I guess we'll start here. The historical irony of the fact that the people who are in Gaza, the ones who are plastered as, you know, the Palestinians, the plight of the Palestinians, the Arabs, they are those who would be the closest lineal descendants of the actual Israelites, and not the people who are operating the nation state of Israel. And I feel like that's a pretty confusing element for a lot of people. So I guess, would you want to expand on that? Maybe give a bit of a backstory of like who actually are the people who are in the Middle East who say they are Jews but are not?
Yeah, so this is a topic that specifically is something that I actually don't have a personal well-formed opinion on. You know, there's multiple theories, as you're probably aware. Giles Corey goes with the theory that the modern Palestinians are most likely the descendants of the actual people of the Old Testament, who have just, you know, they just stayed in that location, and over time they became the people living there now, as opposed to the modern Jews are a different group of people. I forget if he talks about the Khazars or not. I don't know if you remember.
I think it's the Ashkenazim, I believe is what he mentions is in the preface at least.
Yeah, and you know, the question is, who are the Ashkenazim? Where do they come from? And
Right.
this is where you'll hear people talking about the Khazar theory, or whether they're Turkic peoples, or whether they're from like southern Italy or somewhere else. And I, at this point, in my personal understanding, I do lean toward the idea that the people who call themselves Jews today do not have a lineal descent to the people of the Old Testament. I don't know if I could personally go much, you know, say anything further in confidence than that. His theory is that the modern Jews are more likely to be the descendants of the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, and the Carthaginians. And part of the evidence he talks about that is that those peoples had practiced human sacrifice.
Yeah.
He also traces the potential history of the Star of David to, I think, Sidon, which was in a Phoenician city, not a Hebrew city. And then you get into, you know, the Star of David and its connections to Saturn and other stuff. So, you know, I think that there's, with a lot of every angle of like this question, whenever I hear it put forward, I think, you know, there's something there. I'm not sure that I've encountered any version of it that I think is capturing the whole truth of the matter.
Interesting.
But I think it's relevant certainly to consider, and I think there's a lot in his particular treatment of it. You know, at the very
Yeah.
least, you do get across the idea that you know, there's no legitimate claim that these people have to that land. Certainly not like the theological Christian Zionist claim that they try to make.
Yeah, right. And when I'm glad that you had brought up this, you know, just the way that the kind of the Soviet bloc you had mentioned a bit earlier, you know, they had this kind of change of pace, and won't spend too much time on like the whole founding of Israel, because it's a rather robust story and there's a lot there. But in that kind of framing though was that kind of guns race that was occurring. You know, you have Egypt, you have Syria, you have Israel, amidst you know, the Nakba and the other terrorist groups there that were helping build and foment and otherwise, you know, resettling and recolonizing areas there in Israel. That it is like, if you just go back 100 years, you're like, oh, the people who are here like literally came from Europe. It's like this is like they're clearly not like from this area. It was obviously the mass immigration and exodus that was occurring from the world wars, or the rather the latter world war more often than not. And that's kind of brings me to maybe a bit more of a broad point before we get into the next thing here, which is why is there such a staggering amount of historical ignorance when it comes to not even just biblically, but also just even maybe more Platonic, just historical concepts and facts? Like, where does this come from? Because you'll see like this reaction from people at large when just basic facts are stated, that they have this kind of emotional reaction to it. I'm kind of curious. I know there's a concerted effort to make sure people are, for lack of better words, retarded. But why do you think that even in the churches, this is something I thought about too. Why did I have to go and look myself to understand historical, context? People in other nations around when Jesus was alive. Why is it never talked about? Why do you think is there a very strong concerted effort to make sure people just simply don't know and are ignorant?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, if nothing else, that's true. Again, I think the um, ruling class, especially if you understand it in terms of group conflict between Jew and Gentile, they have a obvious interest in making the Gentiles retarded and, like you said, and uninformed. I think it maybe should be noted that uh, it's easy, or it can be easy sometimes, to kind of misunderstand the concept of like the Jewish conspiracy at work here. And uh, you get like people argue online about like what is and isn't low IQ anti-Semitism,
Yes.
uh, which is not a rabbit hole that I think we really need to go down. But the the point is that at the bottom of all of these things, wherever they're expressed in society, in the church, in our theology, in like our understanding of history, in anything, there is just at root an extremely rational dynamic, which is group conflict. And Jews are simply much, much more racially conscious than we are. The kinds of things that we think, we have to kind of like get together in a smoke-filled room. We got to plot out everything down to the minute detail.
Right.
Jews do meet in smoke-filled rooms and plot world domination. Like that's there's just a picture circulating, I think today or yesterday on Twitter, of like a bunch of Jews meeting. I forget, it was a Trump was meeting
Yes, it
with
was Elon
in
Musk,
Britain,
Peter
or
Thiel, somebody else, I believe.
yeah, maybe, or maybe it was another one. I mean, there's plenty of them. But the point is
Right.
that, while they do that, they also don't need to do that, because like for them, everything they do, they have a very keen awareness of what is good for their people. And
Right.
again, good for their people. In this case, we've already talked about how that is kind of a uniquely uh, anti-righteous instinct in this case. But if a Jew's writing, helping write like a history book, or they're operating in the Christian world in whatever way, they don't need like marching orders from the World Zionist Congress or something like that. Like they fundamentally feel what they want to be doing, and that's the way in which you see this, their interest expressed throughout all of society. And that's why sometimes people will kind of uh, try to like criticize this explanation by saying, oh, it's too abstract, it requires too much, like you're saying the Jews are all powerful. It's like, no, they're absolutely not all powerful. You can see their performance in Gaza, among many other things, as evidence of that.
Right.
But they're simply just better organized. They're better attuned to their own group interest. It really is that simple, and that's those are very replicable things.
Well, let me ask you this, because this was actually a topic of discussion in my community a little bit ago. Can you give somebody a racial conscience?
I think it goes partly, at least, back to the question that you'd asked earlier about, can you give someone conviction? I I don't know. It's not exactly the same question. It's frustrating. This can be like one of the most frustrating things in practice, because it's like you can lay everything out You can lay it out emotionally, or you can lay it out logically or historically. And some people will just be like, well, like, why do I care? You know, what do other white people have to do with me? And I don't know. I guess maybe I don't have a good answer. Like at that point, like you have to
Interesting.
have you have to have a basic level of self-preservation, I guess. You know,
Yeah.
like people tell you that they're going after you because you're white, and you're like, oh well, what does that have to do with like me personally? A whole lot, you know.
Right.
So
Right. Well, I guess where I would step in is I don't think that from ground zero, I could just bring an argument to the table. You know, we're sitting in a room with somebody and I could, whether I show them a documentary or I show them this, hear this cool TikTok or I read them a book, I don't think that none of that would give you a racial consciousness into somebody else. It would probably prime them to be more prepared for some of these things or the patterns of behavior. But the way I see it is actually literally what just occurred with Steven Crowder, I think yesterday. Steven Crowder had said something to the effect of, I've went my entire life not trying to look through a racialized lens, but it becomes incredibly evident the more that you realize that you are being viewed as a group, just as you had just put, that all of your enemies view you as being a part of this group. He's like, it's incumbent upon the people inside of that group to recognize that fact. And so I think you can give somebody a racial consciousness just by the natural progression of things. And as people kind of wake up to the fact of like, oh wait, it really is every other group is placing white people at the number one, list of top villains in the world. And you have to acknowledge that. You can't operate without it. And I think this is it takes a bit of a hammer and chisel to a lot of these weaker libertarian arguments you might hear from somebody like Caroline Borisenko, however you say that, which is, it's not, our enemies aren't after whiteness, they're after capitalism. And I find those arguments to be rather obtuse and far from the truth and far from the reality, because I agree with what you're saying. I think it does go back to extreme, group conflict. How small those groups, I think you could have an argument about that. Like, where do the groups actually have where does the flint strike the rock? But I think there is elements that can't be ignored. And I do wish I could give somebody racial consciousness. I wish I could just hand them something and say, hey, like, get in line, brother, like we're going to war. But unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. And it is in the same level of conviction, too. Like, somebody organically for themselves has to hold that dear to themselves. No one can just tell you something and you hold that as your own. And it's kind of like when you yourself have an epiphany. It's like no one told you that. It was that you had that moment because you yourself had that realization. And I think that's ultimately what people need. And I think it's part of, people like you and I's job to give as much material as we possibly can to help people walk themselves into giving themselves a racial conscious. Forgive me, I kind of ranted a little bit there long. The next kind of big segment I want to get into is the Zionist occupied government. And that is, as you would put it, the biggest question. And especially as it pertains to us here being in America, that is what obviously plagues us the most. And it's in that there has been this two-pronged kind of approach to when they did occupy. And you could go back to, 1896 with the Jewish state, the birth of Zionism. But you go to the Schofield Bible and the people who were involved in there, Louis Marshall, Untermeyer, and Darby. And as you kind of go through these elements, you can see, just for one, how degenerate some of these people were. And you see the people who are helping them, write the edit references, the Lotus Club, all these elite stuff that we're seeing now in the Epstein files, quite frankly. And it's always been of my opinion that it was two-pronged. And I do agree with Corey in the book that the more important element, the stronger element, is the top-down function. It is the elites who are wielding millions of dollars. They're funneling money, financing project after project, AIPAC, World Jewish Congress. I mean, there's like 4,000 of them at this point. But also secondarily to that, but can't be ignored, is the ground effort, which is where the Christian Zionists come in, which are these individuals who have essentially perverted the word of God. They've made it some kind of like hybrid religion. It's got the moniker, right? Judeo-Christian, etc. And it's in there that I find the easiest thing, I think, to be able to peel away would be the ground support. In having more discussions and debates with individuals who push this stuff like Mike Huckabee and others, when it's so easily disproven. And so in that kind of line of thinking, I'm kind of curious, could you give could you give a pretty simple example or expansion on like what is this argument? Like, why is Christian Zionism, in a few short sentences, so wrong? What do they get wrong about the promise? What is there that is a quick 1, 2, 3 point punch that you could give to somebody and say, this is why this is factually incorrect?
I mean, fundamentally, they have to necessarily, for the way the theology functions, they take promises that are referencing Christ and they make them about the physical Jews. And so, one of the best examples is when God says to Abraham, through you, through your seed, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. And so that's something that I used to hear a lot as interpreted as that means the people of Israel. That means, the Jews are a unique people. If you bless them, you'll be blessed. If you curse them, you'll be cursed. I mean, the problem is that this isn't actually reflective of reality. Those who bless the Jewish people are cursed by them. Those who, keep them at arm's length tend to do a lot better. Yeah, and I think the book of Galatians is one of the best for dealing with this. I think I don't remember which chapter it is. It is that I think it's 3 that Paul deals with that specifically and clarifies. Just in case it wasn't obvious to you, like he just says it, so you don't have an excuse. This is referring to Christ. The seed through which the peoples of the earth will be blessed. The seed of Abraham is Christ himself, and that is obviously true, and that is like a microcosm of this whole theological debate, is that every promise that they want to attribute to the physical Jewish people, first of all, necessarily means that they're not concerned with whether those people are saved or not. So they end up putting unsaved people over the church, over the people of God. And second of all, they're stealing those promises from Christ or from the church. And there's just no other way that it works.
It's actually a great explanation. Thank you. Stealing the promises, I think that actually it fits. So now they do lie, cheat, and steal. So we do have all 3 now. I guess though, going back to like the 2 prongs here, I guess my next question then would be, what would be your prescription if you were given the keys to command an army? How do you, well, not like a physical army, but how would you start walking back the heresy of Christian Zionism? Where do you attack it? How would you attack it? And what do you think would be the most effective? And when would you call it a victory?
Well, I think that part of the answer is that I think that these issues, kind of like you referenced earlier, they necessarily have a political context. So you can't have like a purely theological victory or a purely cultural victory without a political victory. If you have a political victory, like the other 2 are going to be part of that, or they're going to follow. I think, in the short term, it's probably relevant to at least note that, like you said, even though there is and historically has been a bottom up element to this as well, ultimately, the single biggest reason for the success of Christian Zionism is the top down influence of Jews and Jewish money power and political power. Like all fake things, it requires a level of putting your hand on the scales and of censoring the opposition. And if there weren't censorship of the opposition, if there weren't Jewish political and economic persecution of dissidents, then the debate would be won pretty quickly. But naturally, then you realize that is actually the problem. It's the fact that the Jews have the ability to use political and economic power to suppress dissent, and so that's the battle to be won. Maybe even more so than winning the theological argument is very important for a number of reasons. It's important for peeling people away from that. It's important for moralizing your own side, but it's not ultimately separable from the political fight.
I would agree with that, and I like that answer too.
And if I can just say one more thing on this, another book isn't one of ours, but that I think I don't remember when it was originally published. It's a little older at this point, but that I think is actually very important, remains very useful on this issue, is the Israel Lobby, by Walton Mearsheimer.
Yeah.
And they really, essentially, like, the primary thesis of the book is demonstrating that it is specifically the Jewish lobby that drives American foreign policy. And so they disprove the idea that this is like Christian Zionism is fundamentally to blame. Like, Christian Zionism exists, but there is so much more Jewish money and influence and hands on the levers or on the scales than people think. And it is specifically the Jewish lobby more than any other force that has contributed to the current political situation.
Yes, and I think it can be missed that the majority of the time, like a lot of these donations and the mission and the work being done by the religious Christians is being given to non-religious secular Jews, which is kind of just a wild, kind of consequence to that kind of relationship there. And then I guess there's another direction I wanted to take this, going to Krie Baller. And I think this kind of shows us the modern application of these fights happening in modern day as of like 2 or 3 days ago. And so I'm kind of curious, like, have you been paying attention to the Krie Baller, and like, what are your thoughts on the current kind of iteration of her being, I think recently, a few hours ago, she was removed from the commission?
Yeah, I watched the video, or one of the videos that people were sharing about her, the discussion she was having at the hearing, and I think that she's been since removed from the panel, or from the I forget what the word is, but it's a particularly, obviously, kind of like a particularly blatant demonstration of Jewish power to just openly pluck this person out of there because they were asking the wrong questions. I mean, if you watch the exchange, it's really something. It always kind of gets my blood boiling to just like see these people talk, because of the hypocrisy and
the chutzpah.
Yes, yeah. No, there's really no other word for it.
Right.
So I think that I mean, the specific thing that they were discussing in the clip that I watched was, she's pressing them on whether Zionism is inherently anti-Semitism. It's a very interesting question, and she was approaching it from the perspective of that, there are some Jews who say that it's not, and so I don't want to be an anti-Semite. I'm just an anti-Zionist, and the guy was saying, no, it is anti-Semitic, and I think that I think her position is perfectly fine. I think it's obviously coming from a principled place, but ultimately the Jew in that case was right. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism in a literal sense. It is opposition to Semitism, Jewish influence specifically here, and there's no comparison between the Jewish states and other countries in the world, and that was one of the things he was saying. It's like, you wouldn't say this to another country. Well, they're not you. They're not the same. I'm sorry, I forget kind of the initial thrust of your question, so I was just kind of talking about the video.
Yeah, no, well, so I watched like front to back. I watched that whole interaction, and then I watched through a lot of the clips as well, because there was like some notable people there. But I guess the general thrust of the question was just the overall framing of what's happening with Krie Baller touches on almost a lot of what's involved in this conversation, and it does, I think, give the most recent paradigm to look at this battle happening between Christianity versus Judaism, or just the Jewish entity at large. And it had, everything. We're talking about what we had just mentioned, right? The chutzpah, the audacity to act so entitled and be so openly hypocritical. Within like 3 minutes of themselves, and plenty of little hats. But it also had what I thought was maybe more important, which was Seth Dillon. And it was the interaction with Seth Dillon, who is, the writer for the Babylon Bee. He is someone who has proudly called himself a gatekeeper of the conservative right wing. And now they are because of the recent kind of just direction of the conversations, he's now essentially had to move to being out and saying it's a good thing. Because before he would deny that, right? Like, I'm not for censorship, I'm not trying to control the conversation. Now you're posting tweets in the year of 2026. I'll say this without apology, I'm for gatekeeping. And they do this backwards tactic where it's very convoluted, where they'll say one thing, but when you ask them about it directly, they go, oh, no, you don't understand. Let me say it again in another more convoluted way that still doesn't answer your question. And we got multiple of those from that moment. But I was probably the most proud of Krie Baller directly putting up on the screen, not on screen, but directly posing 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14 through 15. And I like that better than even what you would get from Revelations 2:9, because it referenced what you referenced earlier, which was when Paul's writing, their nature of Jews is contrary to all men. And where we are right now is in the immediate aftermath. We have Laura Loomer and every other Mike Huckabee, all these Zionists coming out of the woodwork screaming and demanding, this is the worst, this is the most worst thing ever. She used this moment to be about herself. So far going into attacking her for wearing a Palestinian flag pin, which is very common kind of pushback that the Zionists get for waving the Israeli flag everywhere, and you can just see it being flipped on its head. I guess in that moment, I also thought to myself, is that what we need? Have we all been wrong? Is what we actually need to push in this progressive era? Do we need a Joan of Arc like figure? Do we need a woman to do it? Is this the environment we are in now? Is it would be easier to support a boss girl who's pushing for the right things than it would be to fight against all of the other social negatives that come with a Chad of a man, somebody like a Joel Webbon or a Corey Muller. What's your opinions on that?
I don't know. I mean, she's there. She's in that position. She's saying the right things. So I think that deserves support. I don't think that means that we have to, crown her Joan of Arc. I guess that's what I would say. It's, you should always support someone who is saying the right thing, who is standing up against evil.
Right.
But what you make of them after that is a separate question.
No, I get that. What's the general? No e-girls, not even once. That is the rule, and there's no working around that one. But I did like the moment a lot, and I did like the fact that we got a bit more out of Seth Dillon about this gatekeeping element, and then we know it's a thing, and we know that they are spending every ounce of effort they do on social media to steer the conversation and redirect it, and it does show themselves.
If I could,
go ahead.
Sorry, if I could just chime in on that, I think that's also a really good illustration of, again, what the fundamental conflict here is, because just like you noticed, Seth Dillon and other people like him, they'll do the whole conservative principled thing. We need to have free speech. We need to let everything be out there. This is our fundamental principle. But when it goes a little too far to threatening Jewish power, then they completely change their tune. And, you'll notice that they don't do that for white people, for example, or they don't do that for Christians, but they do it for Jews. That's where they make the exception. And so that shows you that this is really fundamentally, again, a group ethnic conflict, and they've just chosen the other side. And that is what they really believe. That is their fundamental principle.
Right. Whether you would say the existence of Israel or just the existence of the Jewish people, that is 99.99999% their operant principle. So the moment that's threatened, which is, again, describes the birth of the neocons, the moment that it becomes threatened, they will throw all their principles aside because, again, their number one most common value, their number one highest prioritized value is exactly what you described, right? It is their relationship to themselves, their in-group bias, and the nation state that they have since developed over the last 100 years. And I guess moving a bit more into a hard segue here, the Christian question. And the Christian question was essentially posed by the late Samuel Francis. And he essentially makes the point, the question, and it's something I've thought about too. And I think part of the reason I think about it is just how many non-Christians are in the dissonant right now, which I guess I wasn't expecting to see that, or maybe I wasn't even aware of just how maybe expanded those kinds of ideas have become over the last few years. But the question, simply put, is this: does the Christian faith support or oppose the right to defend the European American way of life? And I'm kind of curious, what would your answer to that be?
I mean, my answer is that it isn't, a fundamental threat to the European way of life. It's not something that is inherently deconstructive of European civilization. So I'd agree with the author. This is basically his position. The modern anti-white tendencies of mainstream Christianity, or you could say, what calls itself Christianity, are just not Christian. And you in some places you'll increasingly see this more and more blatantly, especially when people are persecuted from modern churches and kicked out over things like racism or being pro-slavery or something like that. I know that you saw this with Sam Ketchum recently. There's another guy that I follow, Thomas Boer, who's also had some good posts about this recently. And whenever this is the issue, like first of all, there is very often a significant lack of scriptural or historical argument for why these people should be persecuted. And secondly, there's also correspondingly, in many cases, just downright anti Christian behavior on the part of the institutional church that is going after these people. And so that is just a really stark, like in your face illustration of how, in fact, these fundamentally anti-white ideologies are simply not Christian. They are in fact anti-Christian. You cannot hold them consistently and maintain, a Christian moral life or even like a theological stance in other ways.
Yeah.
I would say, if I can maybe go back to the first part of what you were saying as well, from my perspective, having been at least like adjacent to these kind of politics since like the time of the alt-right, I would say that it's actually gone in the opposite direction. There are more Christians now than there used to be who are involved in these type of politics and who are speaking out about issues like white displacement or Jewish power. And I think that um, I think this is a phenomenon that I would say for Protestants specifically, that a lot of them, like as a whole, obviously not the whole Protestant church or even the majority of it, but insofar as Protestants are represented among the radical right now or the dissident right or whatever you want to call it, they have internalized a lot of the criticisms that Christianity used to receive, which I think is also very much in line with this book and what he's kind of trying to do with it. It's that like you had a lot of criticisms being leveled at Christianity because of the behavior of the churches, which was in many cases just manifestly anti-white. And there was only ever one correct response to that, which is for Christians to start being the solution that they want to see, start being the change that they want to see in the world, so to speak, as opposed to just like complaining that, the pagans and the secularists like don't like us too much. It's like, well, you can do that all you want, but like at the end of the day, these people are pointing to specific things that they have a problem with that are wrong. And so the best thing you can do is just like you yourself start being part of the fight against these things. And I think that a lot of Christians have done that. I think that it is a specifically Protestant phenomenon because there were a lot of Catholics. There's a much bigger proportion of Catholics back then. I think, there's still a lot of Catholics now that are doing these politics, but in comparison, you have a much larger proportion of Protestants who are also getting in the fight now.
Yeah. And it's good to hear, because for somebody who's rather new to the scene prior to just the last couple of years or so, I've probably gotten like the most pushback. Well, obviously just outside of just leftists in general. But probably just the most pushback from a bunch of pagans, for lack of better words. And I think I saw this argument earlier. I think it was maybe from a couple of days ago. I've seen it from a few people as well in the space that have a good bit of influence. Their argument is that given the current nature of what we are up against right now, it is better to team up, for lack of better words, ally, temporary ally, with those who are pagan for the plight of the anti-white battle. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that. Is that the temporary alliance that you think should be built and forged, rather than one across the aisle with sodomites for base level conservative values?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you definitely. I guess the simple answer is yes. I would agree. I mean, it's certainly the stance of the company. We're not pro or against uh, any of these things in a political sense. I mean, we've published Christian books, we've published books by Catholic authors, by Protestant authors, we've published pagan books as well. If something we're never going to publish something that's like a scathing attack on Christianity from a pagan perspective or something like that. We're not going to publish like a purely theological work that's attacking paganism, not because we do or don't like agree with any of these things, but just because it's not like our place to do so.
Right.
And so we officially our stance is definitely to treat it as a panracial, fundamentally a political struggle that white people are involved in, and ultimately you can
Yeah.
hold everybody to the same standard. It's like you should put this issue of our collective well-being first, and that applies just as much to pagans as it does to Christians and everybody else.
Right. It's kind of how I view Matt Walsh. Everyone who's like actually meaningfully in the fight is like watching what's happening with Krie Baller, and then Matt Walsh is fighting something. I think he's still talking about the Super Bowl halftime show. And there comes a certain point where you do have to look at your priorities and what the fight is worth having. You do have to pick your battles, and I do agree. I think I do largely agree that fighting, battling pagans when there's a much greater threat at the door, can be saved for the future. I think we can put those battles aside for now. And I guess going a little bit further, here's another criticism of this, right? And this is from Oswald Spengler, and I'd actually not even seen this until I'd read the book. Christianity is the grandmother of Bolshevism. And there does seem to be an element. Now, I have actually gotten into a few different interactions with this individual, and there's a couple of them, but he goes by the name of Handsome Truth. I forget what his actual name is. And there are many of those who are very oppositional to Christianity. So much so that they go out of their way to attack Christians almost as much as they do attack the Jewish faith and Jews. And so it's in there that you kind of do have this line where you kind of think of, and again, they'll commonly say, you worship a Jew. But as we described earlier, if the lineal descendant, the genealogy, I should say, is rather incorrect, and it's like these Palestinians, it's like the math doesn't add up there. And I guess it's in that, though, what do we do about those individuals, I guess? Because I'm thinking there's two kind of large factions that have very kind of militant optics, very aggressive tactics. And I think overall, when you compare that to what's actually occurring, like in Australia, for example, and I know you might not be following with what's occurring in Australia, but when you look at individuals like Joel Davis and Thomas Sewell and the draconian laws they basically put down that, they can disband a group at will if they find them to be hateful. I guess I'm curious, is there an element where you would, like we just dog said, Dylan, for gatekeeping, but is there an element where you would gatekeep what level of this kind of, I guess not even to say violence, but just, edgy tactics that you would implore? Or would you say all bets are off, we're in a full out war?
It kind of seems like there are a couple of questions there. So I would say maybe just briefly, for Christians specifically, my personal stance has always been if there's someone who has like kind of right-wing critique of Christianity, then either I think it's nonsense, and so I'll just go about my day and not worry about it, or if I think that they're pointing to something that's genuinely a problem, then I will try to align myself against that problem, and again kind of go about my day, not worry about it. And ultimately one of the best ways that I think we can be witnesses to other white people is by fighting for them. Now, when it comes to like the NSN, I think they're called in Australia. Yeah, I mean, I don't, and again, we're not gonna as an Antelope Hill representative, I'm not going to like single out people on the right for criticism, or at least I
Yeah.
try to do it as little as possible.
Yeah.
Certainly, I would not, do that to the NSN. I think we uh, support them, at least in a broad sense. I certainly, I get what I specifically want to focus on is their persecution by the Australian state is not a good reason to engage in criticism of them. And I'm not saying I have another criticism of them. I don't, frankly, if only because I don't know enough. I have some familiarity with Joel Davis and Thomas Sewell, and
Yeah.
I think they're
Well,
good
I guess let
people. I
me
think they're
reframe the question then, because I'm
well,
this.
if I could just
Go ahead.
because I wanted to kind of get something here. We support them. We support their fight, and I think that the most important thing is that uh, the fact of their persecution by the Australian state is not. You can't really, until the battle is won, you can't really take something like that as a failure, or like a fundamental flaw with their tactics. Maybe in the long run can decide that those tactics were not helpful or something, but not like right now. Not it's certainly not very good solidarity, I think, with other white people to kind of beat them when they're down.
No, I
And
get that.
if anything, you could just as easily make the argument that the fact that they have to be censored and shut down so openly and without any kind of real excuse for it is a sign that they're actually getting, that they were really hitting the pulse. They were really kind of getting somewhere. They were making things uncomfortable for what is ultimately an anti-white regime. So I think that at the very least, we should always be supportive of dissidents who are persecuted for their politics.
Yes, and maybe I misspoke, but because in the aftermath, some of the reporting coming out of Australia was saying because of what they did to those individuals, it actually made all the groups that were priorly oppositional to them actually sympathetic, because then it was in that moment that it kind of called into question the legitimacy of the Australian government. Thus, a lot of these left-wing groups going, it could be us next. I guess more so, I'm speaking very strategically, because if we are in a civilizational war, we do need to be thinking about what is strategic elements, what can people be doing at home, right? What are people who are wanting to get involved, people who are wanting to push for things? There needs to be some semblance of an idea that we can give somebody that says, these are the things that you should do. These are the tactics that are good. These are the ones that we should. And I guess to that extent, and you can keep it as, I guess, maybe, as restricted or as simple as possible. Is there an element where you think, though, regardless of, keeping Australia out of it, is there a line that you can cross where you can go too far, and perhaps this line that you cross also hurts the movement in general? And this seems to be a very kind of common perspective, just seeing the overall nature of things occurring. I'm kind of curious then, in that element, would you have, as simple as a line may be, would there be a line where you would say, hey, maybe Christians probably shouldn't push for these kinds of tactics?
Oh, I mean, I would say certainly I would have no problem saying, you shouldn't break the law. You shouldn't you shouldn't do illegal things. You kind of have to say that in any case. It
Right.
tends to be good practice. I think that maybe this kind of gets at what we were talking about a little bit earlier with and you can tell me if I'm not really answering the question when I'm done here, but with
Okay.
like the infighting on the right. And I think this is maybe where the idea of no enemies on the right comes in.
Right.
And the thing with infighting is that you can only really contribute to the solution by just not participating. And especially if you have, again, a group that is being persecuted, if you don't think their optics are great or their strategy is great, then just say nothing about it.
Right.
And if you think you have better ideas than other people, then just let them do their thing and you do what you think is the better idea. And there's we can have debates. You have to be able to have some dialogue, but I think there needs to be consideration for making sure that this dialogue doesn't ultimately serve the enemy. It doesn't ultimately demoralize your own people. And you should have a preference, I think, for being open to working with anybody, for being open to supporting, especially, like I said, anyone who's being persecuted. So I don't know if that's getting at maybe what you're asking with the question, but
you
can tell
definitely
me.
did. You definitely did, because I was going to respond back with, I don't agree with Caligula's idea of putting, injecting peptides into your face and, smashing your face with a hammer. But I will support a what is to me a white pioneer, an autistic kid, trying to ascend, right? And it's on those ends that I do have the solidarity there. Like, I'm not going to go and attack him for some minor reason, because as long as he's continually doing well and bringing attention to matters that are ultimately, fit for him, maybe less so, but politically relevant, I think are decent, because he's opening up eyes to this kind of two-tier justice system, just in the nature of the way that he's reacting. And I think that's great. I think it's great advice. That's how I tend to operate. I try to avoid getting involved in any of the infighting. I just hold my tongue. What's the saying? Lurk more. I try to really just absorb as much as I possibly can, unless it feels like it comes to a point. And I think that's where we are right now, which that point is there is this very excessive, I don't want to say schizo, but paranoia that everybody's a Fed. And as much as Netter was pushed, no enemies to the right, it felt like in the couple of days afterwards, everyone's still calling each other a Fed. And there is this element there that people are they have a hard time trusting each other in the dissonant space. And for good reason. When you see, like, when the Discord servers with, I believe it was at the Michigan governor, you do kind of think, like, it's hard to trust somebody I've never met before. And I think that adds to this general nature of animosity towards everybody, where if it's not crystal clear, on a silver platter, they're not going to accept it. They're going to think something's off with it. And this even pertains with candidates that we should be pushing for, which I would say is in, like, people like Casey Putsch and James Fishback. Both of these individuals, though, however, there's a lot of things that people bring up. They go, well, and they're finding all these minor elements, and it's like, what do you have to lose, right? Who else are you even going to support that's even comes close to this? And it's almost like this paranoia that they're going to, fall for it again. It's keeping us back from having true and fully, comprehensive dialogue. And I hate that. And I feel like that's kind of, does describe a lot of the infighting on the right. And I guess I'm kind of curious, how do we get ourselves to the next step? What gets us away from this infighting? How do we move on to talking about bigger and stronger subjects, fighting the actual enemy at the gate?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a super good answer. I think the best that what we try to do as a company, again, is just to be like friendly to everyone, to not like get involved too much. And that's kind of like my own, I think the best advice that I can give is just like continue to be the change you want to see, continue to be doing the things that you think are valuable, and be willing to work with other people, even if you have some disagreements with them, as long as you're working towards something measurable and tangible. I think maybe if there's an idea that I could also put out there is that, like, accusations of like being a Fed or something, people should interrogate these things a bit more, especially if, like, to themselves. For example, some people say like Tucker Carlson is a Fed, and that might be true. I can't sit here and tell you that he's not, but I can say that you can interrogate that idea in different ways. I haven't seen anyone find him in the Epstein files. That's a relevant piece of information toward this thesis. There's his public statements. You gotta, you can ask yourself, well, what is the kind of like rational train of thought that tells me, he's doing this to like subvert something or on behalf of someone else. And you can come to whatever conclusion you want to, but my point is that like a lot of the times people will make this more of like an abstract thing than it should be, and labeling like fishback some bad or good or whatever. And it's like at least try to just like rationally test this theory first before you kind of just go wild with it.
Yeah, kind of the what you had said earlier, right? Like this internalization, and it feels like a lot of this is internalization of the beautiful loser phenomenon, if you will. I think Stephen Wolfe is who I see that coined by. But I guess moving on,
I think that was Sam Francis, the original coiner of that phrase.
Sam Francis is the original coiner of that phrase. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. The moving on, I guess we kind of covered a lot about Christian Zionism. I guess I'd move on to the Christian racialism, and this is kind of another strong theme in this book. And that theme has been, I think, you could just look at it from the perspective of what's occurring right now. And again, I know you're going to probably give a similar answer to this. So let me try to think of a way to frame this in a way that won't make you feel like you're taking a side. But I guess we do have these battles occurring right now, and this seems to be there's two large leaders of this. You have the Joel Webben Christian nationalism, and then you have the Stonechoir Christian nationalism. And I guess instead of me asking a question that might make you feel like you have to take a side, I won't. I guess I would just say in there, what would you take note of what is different between these two groups? What do you think is going to be the more successful group, and which group do you think people should push for or is more correct? If you even want to answer that one.
Well, I mean, I certainly can't take a side here, even if I'm not implying that I see it as like necessarily and whatever. I know a little bit about what these people think about each other. It's what I can say. I think I can praise them both. We've had decent relationship with both. One of our authors, Kevin McDonald, who wrote the foreword for this book, he's been interviewed by Joel Webben twice. Very appreciative of that. That's fantastic. And just the fact that he's able to have that platform to make his work better known and to put out his ideas is valuable in and of itself. Stonechoir as well. I think that Stonechoir has definitely achieved something in American Protestant Christianity specifically through their podcast that is, an undeniable political and metapolitical step forward. Yeah. They're essentially like just a battering ram for a lot of important ideas, a lot of important questions as well that they introduced. That's absolutely something that I think people need to appreciate. I think that you should, if maybe you're not as radical as some other people, every successful political movement has to be able to appreciate its radicals and to shelter them to some degree, because they're the ones on the front lines. And I think that's relevant to consider
their hands
here.
On the Overton window, if you will. They're the ones that are like leaning on it.
Right. I would also, the last thing that I would say kind of more broadly, and maybe this applies to Joel Webben, maybe this applies to other Christian nationalists or other pastors as well, is that at least I know for a fact that now you at least have churches that, are not going to kick you out for trying to learn about the Holocaust, for example, or, having your own ideas about World War II, or, treating it appropriately as an empirical question. And that's a very positive step forward, because again, that's something that is material, that's tangible, that's, people are less persecuted now, at least in some places. And that's very praiseworthy as well. So,
which is a massive positive. I guess we could probably explore these themes from the way that kind of, as Corey describes, and through that view. I guess I'll pose this question. Is the number one difference between those two camps the element of how race applies to Christianity, in your opinion?
Between like Joel Webben and Stonechoir?
Yes.
Uh, I mean, to be honest, I don't think that I can really speak for either of them on this. So I don't know that I really can answer the question. So
Gotcha.
sorry about that, but
No,
yeah.
you're fine. I wanted to explore the Christian racialism, right? And so it's in these elements with Giles Corey that you kind of get these ideas, and which has been posed and brought up by people like the Backlash, which includes Vincent James, Dave Riley. This idea of, can you actually even have a Christian nation if it's not white? So I guess without the camps attached, what would be your answer to that question?
Well, so, if we can talk a little bit about history again, I think that I used to personally be actually a little more against the label of Christian nationalism, because for a while there was kind of like a struggle going on as to what it meant. And you would actually see people online using Christian nationalism to mean like anti-racism, a multiracial democracy in which, the Christian part kind of defines the nation part. Uh, Obviously I don't agree with this. I think that you know, I'm glad that the side that doesn't see this way has won out. And I don't mean to actually get so, I mean this broadly.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to like exclude Joel Webb in here. I know he has his own idea of what a nation is, and I'm really just,
Yeah.
no interest in like kind of I when
I
I'm
get
trying
what
to
you're
approach
saying. No, we're
this.
not taking
Yes,
sides. We're speaking
I'm
generally on
approaching
this.
this broadly. Broadly speaking,
Right.
you
I'm
could
sorry if I
call it
made you feel
race.
like I'm pushing you to
Oh,
say something you don't want to.
it's all right. I just, yeah, I mean, like I said, we have good relationships with all these people. So
I get that.
but broadly speaking, you could call it race realism. Just generally the recognition of ethnicity as a kind of the fundamental component, or you could say definitional to nation, to nationalism itself. That has won out. And again, I know that there's still different. Kind of sub arguments to this, but I think that from my perspective, broadly speaking, Christian nationalism now does acknowledge that the nationalism part is its own thing. That is the thing in itself, and that refers to people, that refers to ethnicity, that refers to distinct groups.
Yeah.
And the Christian part is, we want our people to be Christian. We the nation want to be Christian.
Right.
So I actually forget what your question was, but maybe that answers it.
Well, we did get an answer. We did get an answer. I guess well, you'd probably do a bit better job explaining this than I could, but expand a little bit more on that idea, right? What you had said, the idea that it went out, which is the recognition that ethnicity is not a separate element from nation, and in fact, they are quite literally interchangeable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, the Greek or the etymology of the terms here, but they're the same term, race, ethnos, nation. They're synonymous. And I guess we can maybe talk a little bit about just uh, racialism as opposed to racial egalitarianism, or like multiracialism. And this is where you'll have people bring up like there is neither Jew nor Greek, or stuff like that, which I think at this point we kind of all recognize that that's obviously a ridiculous application of that verse. It's not like, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither male nor female. Like, does Christianity require us to be for transgenderism now? Obviously not.
Right.
And fundamentally this is literally just God's created order. If God didn't intend for people groups to exist as distinct from each other, he wouldn't have made us with DNA. He would have made it so if you go over there to that valley or something, your children might be black or yellow, or there's no pattern to it at all. Like it's one of those things that is so fundamental that you can it's sometimes you're kind of at a loss for how to defend it, because you're at a loss for why someone would even question it. It's like, we're just talking about the way that people are. It's
Right.
obviously nonsense to make Christianity to be at odds with this.
That was probably the biggest red pill I ever had in my entire life. Was no matter how many times somebody told me that we're all equal, my mind rejected it. And part of this was because I played in sports for a long time. And I know that you could grab two random men from anywhere, grab two random guys off a school bus, grab two random men off the street, grab two random guys from the same classroom who were born on the same day. Someone's going to win, which therein implies that not everybody's equal. There are winners and there are losers. And not just in the competitive sense, but I think categorically, there's these different elements. And I think that brings apart, which I believe to be true, objectively true, which is there's a major difference between being equal before God and being equal among men. And that seems to be where we need to really push this kind of idea of this temporal sense, because I find that it also stretches to some other elements as well, which would be in the same vein as like crimes and punishment. In the temporal sense, some crimes would be punished much lighter than others, although before God, all sin is equal. And these seem to be very fundamental ideas that are lost on some people. And I would imagine it probably has to do with very weak doctrine. And part of these churches that you go to, you see, I church hop, 2 years ago. They call them gospel churches. It's like they read out of the first 4 books, which is not to say it's bad by any means, but it is to say it omits a lot. And when you omit that much and you maintain a very kind of restrictive messaging for a period of time, people will get a very, in my opinion, perverted idea of what the faith is actually about. And I kind of thought about this in the same vein as the Machiavellian kind of idea of like the simple but stupid wins over the smart but unconfident, which is to say, like when you see the politicians or you see like the mega churches, right? You'll see the pastor say, we got these guys, these pastors are pushing that, there's racial components to this. And they're like, they missed the message of Jesus. Of course it's not that. It's real simple. Love everybody. And like that wins out. Although it's factually incorrect and dumb, but it wins out because of these basic kind of just human psychology premises, which is people just want what's easy, what's simple, they don't have to think about, what doesn't make them feel uncomfortable. And it's in these veins too that I think that you see a lot of this being taken advantage of by the Zionist occupied government, by just the Zionists at large, these AIPAC corporations, these donors, which is they are taking full advantage of the fact that the average person wants convenience, not truth. And to go back to the original point, that was where the red pill came from, was I did grow up around black people, and there was no, and this isn't to be, to be demeaning or anything, and it sucks I have to kind of give this preamble every time, but it was, I knew that we were different. I knew that we were fundamentally different. We were not the same. There was nothing really equal about us. It's not to say one's better or worse, but it is to say it's very observable. And when you pair that with, what is truth, right? Jesus is truth. There's this massive disconnect where even in the most basic of senses, you're being told, and from the institutions on down, to kind of don't believe your lying eyes, don't believe your lying eyes, your lying ears, all of it. I mean, everybody can just tell these things, which does bring about this thought in my head. I've always thought for the longest time, and it seems becoming less true now, that pushing for a more pro-white identity movement would maybe be like something akin to shooting ourselves in the foot. But I guess the more we have gone in this direction, it seems the more we have come open to adopting full-blown white identity inside of the political arena. And I think that's a positive. However, what does stand in the way, though, is the idea that it will be this egalitarian Christianity that will be saying, no, you vehement racists, go back inside the box. That's where I think the next battle is going to be taking place at, and I think it will be, it's already taking place right now. And so I guess inside those veins of what was brought up there, I guess how do you feel like we're going to be able to manage taking over this kind of egalitarian argument, like taking back organized Christianity? Because the way I see it, with Protestantism being a lot more decentralized than, with like the Catholic faith, to me, it would be a lot easier. I can see a path to victory in the Protestant work with just the churches kind of winning one after another, being recaptured by the better ideas in the marketplace. I don't see that same path in the Catholic Church. And I guess, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess I view it as a lot more monarchic, like it's going to go through a heavier, higher executive power, a lot more, restrictive elements to actually push for political changes inside the Catholic Church. And so I guess does that put the Protestant path, does that put them like on a better path? And are those things that you've thought about before?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is an issue where I, as representative of the company, don't really want to take a side. But I'm a Protestant. I have thought about these issues. I think no one can really deny that there's different dynamics at play, and you see that. You've seen that reflected in the participation of Catholics versus Protestants in dissident politics. We've kind of talked about that. You can see it historically. You can see the difference between. Catholics and Protestants in National Socialist Germany, for example. And you had both that participated, that were supporters of National Socialism. You had opposition from both, but at the same time, they had different relationships with it, and you can identify some different trends. So I think, and I don't think that any Catholic would really have a issue with agreeing with that. I think that there's positives and negatives to these things from looking just from kind of like a purely political or material kind of standpoint. There's more preservation of tradition and therefore of traditional values in Catholicism. There's also, more kind of institutionalism. There's less kind of revolutionary potential in some ways. As you're saying, the Protestant church is built on rebellion. It's built on opposing church authority, and so that there's a little bit of there's a certain kind of revolutionary potential that's unique to that. There's also a lot. There's some Protestant churches that have really gone very liberal, very openly. You can go back and forth on how liberal the Catholic Church has gotten, on Protestant churches that aren't as liberal. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is that there's obviously differences that are going to express themselves. I think that ultimately, we all of us have a duty to participate in the struggle against evil, and that's never going to change. That's never going to go away. And as we do that, we will encounter new challenges, and that duty is always going to remain for us.
Yes. I have two other kind of shorter questions I want to ask, but I'm going to turn it over to you. Is there any topic I might have passed by that you wanted to dive deeper into?
No, I think I'm very happy with the conversation. Like we kind of mentioned before we started recording, there's a lot more to this book. Maybe I can I'll just read real quick from the contents so that people kind of get an idea. So you have the Christian question, where he talks about, he kind of introduces the reason for writing the book, the state of modern Christianity and how it's anti-white manifestation is used against Christianity, and how this is something that's fundamentally unfair, in that this isn't representative of true Christianity, but at the same time it is a calling for us to fight against what has perverted the faith, or its institutional representation in any case. Then you have a long section on the heresy of Christian Zionism, which gives a lot of the history of that. And that's very valuable to know. He gets into the historical relationships between Christianity and Judaism, as well as between Judaism and the Jews and Gentiles, Europeans, Christians. He has case studies in Jewish hostility that deal with degeneracy, filth, and pornography, Jewish ritual murder of Christian children. There's a section where he deals with, some of the again, the really anti-white state of the church, gives a lot of examples of that. Then you have Toward a Doctrine of Christian Racialism, where he talks about Christian ethno-nationalism, pro-slavery theology, and then Theories of Christian Violence, which are against absolute pacifism, Christian holy war or crusade theology, and anti-infanticide or pro-natalist violence. So that is a run through to the books. There's a lot more in there that we didn't discuss here, and I think that's fine. I think people you should buy the book.
Yes.
I think everyone should buy it and read it. It is really a very fantastic resource, both in terms of the information it has, as well as in terms of the arguments and how they're presented. And that's why we published it. So.
Yeah, and in the words of Kevin McDonald, it should be required reading for all Christians, which is pretty high praise from Kevin McDonald. And I liked it a lot. And that was one of the last sections I was going to get to, was on the theories of Christian violence. I was going to ask just straight up, were the Crusades justified?
I mean, there are a lot of crusades. I think that no one can really deny that some of them were better than others and more productive than others. I think he particularly focuses on the First Crusade as being a excellent example of Christian theology justifying violence in a way that's very historically justifiable, and I would agree with him on that. I think all of the things aside, I think pacifism is manifestly not Christian. I think pacifism is really just anti-human. Really, I mean, in a sinful world, if you are a pacifist, you're abdicating the struggle with evil. And so, I don't think you should be a pacifist as a Christian. Yeah, I mean, I think that he gives a good discussion of that topic.
Yeah, and hopefully I'm not misremembering, but I do believe there's like a lot of references there to kind of that quick kind of run from like the 80s to like the early 2000s. A lot of these kind of cult like Christian kind of sects that were, the end is nigh, it's over, which does bleed into what you were bringing up, which is this absolute pacifism. Oh, God's got me. And I bring up the Lady in the Flood, story all the time, which is, multiple boats pass her by as she's like stranded on a rooftop, and she's like, praying to the Lord, like, please save me. And as each boat comes across, they're like, hey, ma'am, like, we got to go. You only have an hour left. Next boat comes, ma'am, I could get you, but we got 30 minutes. Then eventually, the last boat comes. She's like, ma'am, I have about 5 minutes. We got to go or you're done. And she says, no, don't worry. God's got me. And then as the story goes, the flood comes. She gets taken away. And when she makes it to heaven, God says, why did you not take any of the 3 boats I sent you? And so it's a story of this kind of separation. Some people seem to have this kind of very fictitious idea of what it would be to see God work, almost as if they would need to see a very like, Hollywood-esque like hand reaching down from the sky. It's like, that's a very far and in my opinion, a very diluted way of understanding, God will steer, but you must row. And I think that's great. Like I had one other thing I wanted to say. Oh yes, just to put you on the spot, gay son or a thought daughter?
Oh, I don't know. I don't like the question as a Christian. I don't want to have to choose. So I'm not gonna.
That's funny. Yeah, I get it. It's just poking some fun at the question that's been floating around. But thank you very much. I appreciate it very much. Let me get your name correct again. I apologize. I didn't see it until earlier this morning. It is Taylor Young.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I appreciate having the interview with you. And is there anything else that you want to say? I know we have all the links in the description below. So that'll be the Substack for Antelope Hill. That'll be Antelope Hill on X, and then the Antelope Hill website where you can purchase not only The Sword of Christ, but also other books like The American Regime, Faith and Heritage, all of which I did get from Antelope Hill. And beyond there, probably nobody was going to follow you personally. I'd imagine you're pretty anonymous.
Yeah, I don't have any personal social media to give, but check us out on the website, on X, on our Substack. That pretty much covers it. On our Substack is where we host our book club podcast, which I co-host. You can also find it on Spotify and some other platforms.
And what was the name again?
That's pretty much it. The podcast is just called the Antelope Hill Book Club podcast. So,
interesting. Okay, I wanted to be sure. I didn't know if I heard it correctly or not.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I think it was a great conversation.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate greatly the books, and I also appreciate the coordination as well, and the quick communications too. We're looking forward to also doing with the American Regime as well, and with Faith and Heritage too. Getting ready to start Faith and Heritage myself personally. But I do hope you have a good rest of your day. And again, everybody, make sure you make your way to Antelope Hill, support them. as much as you possibly can and get some books and some literature as well. And I know for sure if you're watching my channel, you probably need the literature. I know how my crowd is. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And Christ is King, and you have a good rest of your day. And I will see you sometime soon, hopefully.
Get up and get out. Get out. Get out.
I have a question for you.
Say Christ is Lord. Say Christ is Lord. Say it. You say Christ is Lord. Get out. Get out. Christ is